last night we discovered that Charlie had written out his notes on an air sickness bag on the flight here, and we suggested that, perhaps that wasn't the best choice of note paper, but might say it all.
Put our report on that.
So my job is to try to summarize how we got to where we are, but to do so in language that you could use with a decision maker who's not particularly technically adept or familiar with NASA. So I'm going to give a very high-level view of these arguments. And as Sally said, I didn't quite know what we were going to say before I got here because these slides are integrated yesterday. But I did write down my thoughts on the air sickness bag on the airplane, which I brought. And then when in view of Sally's rather pessimistic assessment of the budget, we all thought that might be appropriate. But in any case, this is the way I would start, with a brief introduction of the context in which we find ourselves. And this I'm speaking only trying to summarize my view of what our subcommittee has said and not what the whole committee would be said. But in general, for the last 3 or so years, there have been many commentators, including especially Mike Griffin, who has said that NASA has been asked to do too many things with too little budget. And nothing that we have seen in this review changes this conclusion. And as Sally noted so eloquently, a combination of technical issues and especially the recent budget reallocation makes what had been a difficult situation 3 years ago even worse for the overall program. But our job was not to assess all of the vision for space exploration or constellation or any other exploration architecture you'd like to look at. Our job was to examine the two critical assumptions that underlie all human spaceflight budgeting, either for the current program of record or any other one that you want. And those were for the hard stops to shuttle in 2010 and ISS in 2016. And the gap that follows from the shuttle stop in the ability of the U.S. to launch humans into space until a new vehicle is completed. Now, for the shuttle, the two main questions were, is the assumption of the hard stop realistic and prudent? And what fraction of the savings attributed to the shuttle, stopping the shuttle program, actually can be available and free for the development of further human spaceflight capacity? And with regard to the realistic and prudent issue, we just noticed that the manifest, as currently stated through 2010, is exceptionally ambitious and requires a flight rate that has been approximately twice what the post-Columbia flight rate has been. And so therefore, it is more realistic and prudent to assume, for safety and other operational reasons, that you should relax this schedule somewhat, and to fly the manifest out, and to expect to have done so perhaps by the middle of 2011. Now, this would cost about an additional $1.2 billion, but we think it is both realistic and prudent, and we would recommend that that particular extension of the shuttle program become part of the baseline for any of our future considerations. Now, there's a very complex and technical budgetary issue associated with how much money will be freed by the end of the shuttle program for other development, but to suffice it to say, because shuttle has been carrying many of the institutional costs and many of the costs of retention of capacity and creative personnel, that the amount available will be for development will be significantly less than the amount budgeted for the shuttle program. In the case of the gap, its length depends, of course, on a number of factors: when the new vehicle will be ready, budgetary issues, and so on and so forth. But our assessment has been that due to the factors indicated earlier, it is likely that the initial operating capability for the next human-rated U.S. launch vehicle will come no earlier than 2017 in the program of record. And if, with much greater uncertainty, you examine the alternatives, you reach the conclusion that there's a vanishingly small probability that will shorten the gap and a significant probability that it will be several years longer. So the consequences, the one mentioned all the time in the newspaper, is on raw employment, but for NASA that implies critical skills, operational continuity, and many other features that are important to any human spaceflight program. Just as interestingly, it implies a new regime for ISS resupply, in which the United States, it's a partially familiar regime, but the United States and the whole ISS partnership will be dependent on partly on vehicles and systems that have yet to fly, but are very promising. ATV and HTV from Europe and Japan, continuation of dependence on the Soviets, both Soyuz and Progress, but also, and very interestingly so, on new commercial partners, the COTS vehicles, and they will become increasingly critical, and as we will see, perhaps utilization will depend on their success. And that's the most attractive part of this new regime, in which our partners are in the critical path for ISS resupply. And I'll come back to this later. As far as ISS hard stop in 2015 is concerned, in addition to the reasons that Leroy put out, I think I would add a couple more. One, 15 years of continuous human occupation of space will have been interrupted, and they will be replaced by intermittent sorties after the gap ends. And so the opportunities for continuous public outreach involving astronaut activity will be strongly diminished. Secondly, as you've heard, the international partners will be disappointed, and the question I would have is which leader of a partner country, or for that matter ours, would be comfortable to operate operate the station for only 5 years when it took 25 years to build. And finally, of course, as just the same considerations apply to the financial return from ISS hard stop as did from the shuttle, only a certain portion will be available for program development and new technology. But finally, and this is a point I'd like to make, the station is an area of clear and unchallenged U.S. leadership. Other countries can and are building new launch vehicles, equivalent all the way up to, say, heavy lift. Other stations are building human capsules. No one is building a space station, and we have a 20-year lead in that area, and that is an asset in being, a leadership asset in being. So then that we turned then to the question, well, if all of those downsides are true and we're not sure it's worth the savings, what about ISS renewal beyond 2016 through at least 2020, with no implication that it stops at 2020, but no implication that it would continue? And it's our view that we would like to propose to the rest of the committee that ISS renewal be part of a sort of a base foundational part of whatever strategy for exploration the rest of us want to build. So then, looking at the U.S. and international partners, it's clear they'll feel there's a greater return on their investment, and as we've noted, they've all stated they want an extension. For us, one of the most important reasons, we think, is that it will encourage the COTS launch industry and give them assurance of a market and a place to go for their independent ventures for another 5 years. I think it will promote innovation in the following way. We've never really had operational full utilization experience of a fully operated station. And somebody who has a bright idea now probably won't be able to get it implemented in the next 5 years, but with the 5-year extension after that, there's a greater certainty that a new idea now can actually make it onto the station. And so, as a result, we think this will promote the national lab, as Leroy has mentioned, commercial ventures besides COTS, and particularly U.S. science, which was sacrificed in favor of the development of several of our human spaceflight capacities. That program needs to be reconstructed, and a PI who wanted to start now probably wouldn't fly with the new idea until 2016 or beyond. Finally, here's something. When the station was first proposed, there wasn't an exploration objective. Now NASA has one. We all share it. And the addition of exploration objective to the activities of station, really strengthens its use, because now the station can become a test bed for the technologies and operational procedures that support exploration goals. Finally, with the extension and the greater emphasis on utilization for all these reasons, it becomes prudent to consider whether or not we ought to redesign the user interface and management operation, and to redesign it institutionally to better suit the operation and utilization needs of the future. And one of the ideas that we've heard is something like the Hubble Space Telescope Science Institute, but obviously optimized for human work. Another option that is opened by shuttle extension is the renegotiation of the agreement itself. In 2016, all the partners would need to be involved rather soon in discussions, and the content of that agreement could be enlarged in ways that might be useful to the United States. And we've identified 2 ways. First, to consider ways to broaden the international ISS partnership in line with our foreign policy goals. But another one, which could be just as interesting, is, and here Leroy mentioned it again, to broaden the goals, perhaps, of that ISS partnership to include exploration, so that the ISS partnership begins to work in the way that it would when we have a full-up exploration program. So then, if you in fact think that ISS extension, ISS renewals, the word I'd like to use, should be part of our baseline in that period, then we come back full circle to the arguments that Sally made about shuttle supplementary options 1 and 2. It may, for example, be worthwhile to launch additional shuttle flights for the purposes of resupply of a longer living station and putting up critical and large parts in orbit. We have seen no lack of confidence that the station can be resupplied by the international partnership, but one thing is certain, that the events won't, with the new players and new systems, events won't unfold as planned. So that having a shuttle capacity on hand may be useful, and certainly because of its heavy up and down mass capacity, it can give a boost to early utilization. So it will backstop the new international resupply. It, of course, would have a smoother workforce and operations transition, but as Sally pointed out, financially, any extension of shuttle beyond the 2011 shutdown probably makes sense only in a context in which the rest of you may decide that the world and NASA needs a heavy lift vehicle that is shuttle-derived. So that's how in some ways, that's one gloss over how we got to where we are. And that's what somehow, I'm hoping to provide you some words, Norm, that you can use when the time comes. So thank you.
Thank
Now I
you.
think we can have questions.
Sally, do you want to add a last word?
I think that my last word would be that we want to hear from the rest of the panel. We've got a lot of detail behind each of these scenarios that we've looked at. We've looked at other things in addition and narrowed it down to these. We think that we've tried to identify the big issues, and we've tried to put at least a logical thread through some of the scenarios that we looked at and give you a sense of why we picked these as ones to bring forward to the committee. But now we're really interested in trying to narrow down our scenarios and begin to integrate them, or at least do work that would help to integrate them with things that the other panel members might have. I would add one thing, and that is, I think you probably gathered this from a little bit from my presentation, quite a bit from Leroy and Charlie. One thing that we would like to recommend to the full committee for consideration is that all of the options that we put forward contain an extension of ISS. We didn't start off with that perspective, but just the last month, and then particularly the last 2 weeks, when we've really delved into the issue of ISS and gotten a wide variety of perspectives, I think that we've individually and as a group come to the conclusion that we don't think that the deorbit of ISS in 2016 makes sense, and we also think that if deorbit were going to be contemplated, that there is an awful lot of work to do in thinking about exactly how that would be done and what the implications might be, and that we're not certain that we're fairly certain that all of those costs have not been captured. So there may be a little bit of a false choice here, just in the budget that you could gain in 2016. So, I think that we would like to put forward that yes, we know we need to review the program of record as it stands in the plan, but we think that all the options going forward should continue ISS extension in some form.
Well, thank you all. I certainly have to say it's one of the finer pieces of work I've seen on an airline bag, if nothing else.